What if everything you believed about your family was a lie? Madison Carter was cast out by the very people who raised her, accused, disowned, and erased from her own bloodline. But years later, with a heart scarred yet unbroken, she returns, not for forgiveness but for truth. Beneath the polished facade of the Carter legacy lies betrayal, stolen identity, and a secret that could destroy them all. This is a story of vengeance wrapped in silence, justice carved from pain, and a woman who refused to stay forgotten. Because sometimes, being born into a family doesn't mean you belong. They forgot my 16th birthday, but remembered to iron Scott's jersey. It was the first time I understood what it meant to be invisible in your own family. That morning, the kitchen buzzed with the sound of the blender and the scent of fresh waffles. I had quietly waited for anyone to mention the date. My mother, Judith Carter, was too busy packing Gatorade bottles and yelling up the stairs for Scott to grab his cleats. My father, Robert, scrolled through his phone, muttering stats about the upcoming game. "If they win this weekend, he's a lock for regional," he said with pride. I sat across from them, my unopened book of poetry in hand. The one I'd hoped they'd notice came with an award letter tucked inside. No one did. Scott bounded down the stairs, all blonde confidence and effortless charm. "Hey, Maddie," he said, tousling my hair as if I were a pet, not his older sister. "Wish me luck." "You don't need it," I replied. And he didn't. Not with the way the world bent to make room for him. That night, when the stadium roared and our parents chanted his name, I sat alone at the far edge of the bleachers, the cold metal biting through my jeans. No candles, no cake, not even a rushed apology. Only later did Mom remember, in the middle of folding laundry 2 days afterward. "Oh, honey, I'm so sorry," she said while smoothing out one of Scott's jerseys. "Everything's been so hectic with football." She offered a grocery store cupcake and a distracted smile. I told her it was fine. I'd learned by then not to expect much. Those patterns never changed, just evolved. Years passed, but the hierarchy in our home remained intact. Scott, the golden boy, me, the convenient afterthought. My triumphs in science fairs, my scholarship to MIT, my founding of Nexus Technologies from a one-bedroom apartment in Boston, all of it met with the same benign indifference. "That's nice, dear," my mother would say. "Did you hear Scott might be getting promoted at Powell Construction?" My relationship with my parents became one of polite tolerance, sustained by monthly calls and holiday photos. Still, I had always clung to a foolish hope that some big moment, might shift things. That one undeniable achievement might finally make them look at me and see me. That hope flickered briefly the day Eleanor Wright emailed me. She was the operations director of Bradford Enterprises, a major real estate conglomerate. She'd seen me speak at a logistics and AI conference in Seattle. Her email was precise, professional, and unexpected. "Ms. Carter, I was impressed by Nexus's presentation on adaptive inventory forecasting. We're looking for a strategic technology partner for Bradford Enterprises. Would you be open to a conversation?" I reread the message 3 times before forwarding it to Gregory, our COO. We'd pitched to dozens of companies like Bradford before, always receiving polite brush-offs. But Eleanor was different. She'd noticed the work, the metrics, the vision. She didn't care about family names or frat boy charm. 3 weeks later, I was standing in a sleek glass boardroom across from her, demoing our platform to a team of executives who listened, asked intelligent questions, and when it was over, shook my hand with genuine interest. That was when the contract talks began. What I didn't know then, as I reviewed specs and compliance paperwork late into the nights, was that Richard Bradford, the CEO, was also the father of Tiffany Bradford, the woman Scott had been dating for nearly a year. I found out when my mother mentioned it casually on one of our rare phone calls. "Oop, didn't Scott tell you? He and Tiffany are serious now. Richard Bradford's daughter. You know, Bradford Enterprises, the company he's trying to partner with. Isn't that wonderful?" My stomach twisted. I didn't say anything, because Scott hadn't told me. And he certainly hadn't told Richard who I was, but I told myself it didn't matter. The deal was mine, built on merit, not nepotism. My name was on the contract, not Scott's. Maybe, just maybe, this would finally be the thing they couldn't ignore. A month later, the email arrived. You are cordially invited to the wedding of Scott Carter and Tiffany Bradford. I stared at it for a long time, my fingers hovering over the RSVP button. This was it, the moment I'd hoped for. A wedding that would finally place me not just as a guest, but as someone whose accomplishments mattered. So I said yes. And for the first time in years, I began to believe they might finally see me. The wedding was held at the Bradford estate in Greenwich, Connecticut, an imposing colonial mansion with ivory columns, manicured hedges, and fountains that gurgled with deliberate elegance. I arrived early, dressed in navy silk and subtle heels, my hair tucked neatly behind one ear. It was the kind of outfit you wore when you wanted to be noticed but not pitied. Understated power. Nobody was waiting to greet me at the front. No one even offered my name at check-in. I had to spell it twice for the young woman holding the guest list. "Oh, you're the sister," she said finally, scanning the list again. "Sorry, they didn't mention +1 accommodations." She handed me a name tag. Just Madison, no last name, no title. Inside, the opulence grew louder. Crystal chandeliers reflected light in every direction. Tables were dressed in white linen and gold-rimmed china. A quartet played Bach in the corner. Guests floated by like swans in designer suits and cocktail dresses, their laughter brittle, their hands warm only until the next handshake. I stood at the edge of it all, gripping my clutch. That's when I saw them. My parents. Judith in champagne lace, Robert in a pressed navy suit. She laughed too loudly at something Tiffany's father said, while Robert nodded along like an accessory. Neither noticed me. I wasn't surprised, but I felt it all the same. Then came Scott. He swept in like he was born of the marble floor itself. Confident, polished, and magnetic. Tiffany clung to his arm in a pearl-beaded sheath, her smile calculated for maximum sparkle. Cameras clicked. Champagne flutes lifted. The golden couple had arrived. Scott finally spotted me. He gave a short wave, then approached, dragging Tiffany like a trophy. "Madison," he said, pulling me into a half-embrace that smelled of designer cologne and feigned nostalgia. "Glad you made it. You look—" I hesitated. "Happy." He laughed, as if happiness were the easiest thing in the world. "Can you believe this place? Tiffany's dad went all out." She smiled at me, that perfect Vassar smile. "We've heard wonderful things about your work. Bradford Enterprises is lucky to have you." I nodded politely. "Your father doesn't even know I exist," I wanted to say. But I held my tongue. We exchanged pleasantries. Scott joked about how I used to make robots out of cereal boxes. Tiffany laughed. I laughed too, and then he said it. "You know, Tiff and I were talking. Maybe you could help her brother with his new startup. It's in tech too, blockchain or crypto or something." It wasn't just the words, it was the way he said them. Like I was an add-on, an extension of his network, something useful. I excused myself before I could say something I'd regret. In the garden, under the canopy of wisteria and fairy lights, I found Eleanor. She was speaking with a group of executives, but when she saw me, she broke away. "Madison," she said warmly, offering a real smile. "Glad you're here. I've been wanting to talk to you." We walked toward the koi pond, away from the noise. "I didn't realize the connection between you and Scott until recently," she said carefully. "Tiffany mentioned it." "And here I thought I got the contract on merit," I replied, half joking. "You did," she said. "Believe me, you did." There was a pause. "But I also think there's more going on in this family than you let on." And I've been around long enough to know that what's hidden in families like yours," she glanced toward the house, "rarely stays hidden forever." That stopped me. She looked at me then, not as a colleague, not as a peer, but as someone who saw beneath the surface. "If you ever want to talk," she said, "I'm not just here for business." Before I could respond, a commotion erupted near the tent. Voices raised, gasps, a chair tipped over. People turned. Tiffany stood trembling, a torn envelope in her hand. Scott tried to snatch it back. My mother's voice rang out sharp and brittle. "Where did you get that?" Tiffany's face was pale. "This letter. It says Madison isn't—" The microphone cut out. A hand, Robert's, pulled her away. The string quartet stopped playing. My legs wouldn't move. Because I recognized that envelope, the handwriting, the faded ink. It was the letter I'd hidden 12 years ago, the one my real mother had written. And now, somehow, it had come back. Back into the light. Back to ruin everything they'd built. And I was ready. The next morning, the Bradford estate was unnervingly quiet, eerily so, as if the vines on the walls had swallowed last night's chaos whole. The party cleanup crew worked in silence, scooping up rose petals and half-empty flutes, but nothing could erase the memory of Tiffany's trembling voice reading out that line, "Madison isn't your daughter." No one had spoken to me afterward, not my father, not Judith, not even Scott. I drove back to my apartment in Manhattan in a fog, replaying each frame of the moment in slow motion. The envelope, the handwriting, my mother's name on the bottom, Vivian Carter. She had been nothing but a ghost to me for years. A rumor, a whisper, someone Robert and Judith only referred to in the past tense when they wanted to make a point. "She couldn't handle motherhood," Judith once said, cool and composed over her morning espresso. "You were better off with us." But last night proved something they hadn't intended, that they had buried more than just a woman's name. They had buried the truth. The next day I returned to my apartment and opened the old steel lockbox I hadn't touched in over a decade. The key had been taped under my bookshelf since college, wrapped in yellowing masking tape. Inside the box, among faded photographs and newspaper clippings, was the only thing I had left from Vivian. A birth certificate. It was the original one, issued in Vermont. My name, Madison Elaine Carter. Father, blank. Mother, Vivian Carter. No mention of Robert. And there, clipped to the back, was a hospital ID bracelet in pale blue plastic with a name handwritten in marker. M. Carter, NICU 7A. I had been premature. I had known that. What I hadn't known, what had never been told, was that I spent 3 weeks in the NICU, and that Robert and Judith didn't even appear on the paperwork until 2 months later. I sat on the hardwood floor, the morning light pouring through the bay window like a silent confession. My hands shook, but my mind was clear. In a way it hadn't been in years. They had stolen me. They hadn't adopted me. They had claimed me, rebranded me, and they had made damn sure I'd never ask where I came from. Until now. I scanned the birth certificate for the hospital's name, Greenridge Memorial. It was a small hospital in Vermont, just outside Montpelier. I found their number and called, asking to speak with the archives department. "I'm sorry," the voice said on the other end. "We only keep neonatal records from 20 years ago if there was an open investigation." There was a pause. Was there? I hesitated. "Yes," I lied. "There was. My mother, she disappeared shortly after giving birth. The woman took my number, promised to check, said someone would get back to me." I barely slept that night. My mind ran through every possibility. Every name, every lie, every photo I had ever seen framed on the walls of the Carter estate. 1,000 moments reframed in a new twisted context. By noon the next day, I received a voicemail. Miss Carter, this is Darlene from Green Ridge Memorial. I did a little digging. We don't have your full file, but I found something. A nurse's name. Eleanor Wright. She was the head nurse in the NICU at the time. I believe she's retired now, but I've included her last known address in your email. I opened the attachment with trembling fingers. It was a small home address in Berea, Vermont. Eleanor. That name rang like a bell I hadn't heard since childhood. My next step was suddenly obvious. I booked a flight. Berea was only a short drive from Burlington, and I had just enough vacation time to disappear for 3 days without questions from the firm. This wasn't just about closure anymore. This was about origin, about reclaiming the name they tried to erase. The plane touched down in Burlington under a dull gray sky, the kind that made the world feel quieter than it really was. I picked up a rental car, an old silver Subaru that smelled faintly of pine and cigarette smoke, and started the winding drive toward Barr. As the city faded behind me, Vermont's weathered charm emerged. Barns weathered by time, maple trees lining the roadside, and signs of life that felt worlds away from the pristine sterility of the Carter estate. I found Eleanor Wright's house easily, an aging clapboard home nestled at the end of a sloped driveway, just beyond a modest cluster of mailboxes. The porch sagged slightly under the weight of years, and a wind chime clinked softly in the breeze, its sound oddly comforting. I stood at the base of the steps, clutching a printed copy of my birth certificate like it was armor, and knocked. Nothing. I tried again. This time I heard slow, deliberate footsteps inside. Then the door creaked open to reveal a woman in her 70s, her silver hair pulled back in a neat twist, her eyes sharp and guarded. "Can I help you? Are you Eleanor Wright?" I asked, my voice lower than I expected. She narrowed her eyes but didn't answer immediately. Then, after a long pause, she nodded. I think you knew my mother, Vivian Carter. I was born at Green Ridge Memorial in March 1994, NICU 7A. Something in her expression changed, tightened. A flicker of memory, or maybe guilt, crossed her face before she opened the door wider. "You'd better come in." The inside smelled like lavender and old books. Framed photos lined the fireplace mantel, none of them familiar, but all steeped in history. She motioned toward the worn sofa, and I sat while she made tea, her hands trembling just slightly as she poured. "I always wondered if someone would come looking," she said, finally, setting my cup down on a coaster. Vivian she wasn't like the others. Young, scared but strong. She wouldn't let them take you, not at first. "What do you mean?" I asked. Eleanor sank into her chair with a slow exhale. She was alone, no family, no husband, but she fought for you every day. You were born premature, nearly didn't make it, but when you pulled through, she said you were all she had. I swallowed hard. "Then what happened?" "There was a man," she said, slowly. "Not your father. He worked in some legal capacity, said he was helping Vivian secure financial support, but one day she was just gone. No forwarding contact. We were told she had relinquished custody voluntarily." "Did she?" I asked. Eleanor met my eyes. "That's what they wanted us to believe, but I never bought it." She stood, crossed to a side table, and opened a small box. Inside was a stack of old papers, folded neatly. She handed me one, an incident report. "Vivian Carter, disappearance, March 29, 1994. No follow-up," she whispered. "No police report filed. She just vanished." I stared at the document, heart thudding. The date on the paper, March 29, was 5 days after my birth. 5 days. That's how long she had me before someone made her disappear. "Do you remember the man's name?" I asked. She frowned, then nodded slowly. "Gregory Phillips. Said he worked for a private trust." The name hit me like a stone to the chest. Gregory Phillips, Judith's longtime financial advisor, the man who helped manage the Bradford estate. It wasn't coincidence, it was orchestration. I left Eleanor's house with photocopies of the document and a mind spinning faster than the wheels beneath me. My phone buzzed, with missed calls from Scott and Judith, but I ignored them. They didn't get access to me, not anymore. Back in Burlington that night, I checked into a hotel under a different last name, Carter. I slept with the documents on the nightstand and a single resolution blooming in my chest like fire through frost. If they spent my whole life trying to bury the truth, then I'd spend the rest of mine digging it back up. The Carter estate hadn't changed in decades. It still sat like a monument to generational wealth and unspoken rot perched on the edge of the Berkshire Hills, its stone facade untouched by time, but its foundation steeped in secrets. As I drove through the iron gates, the same ones that once loomed like prison bars during my teenage years, my fingers tightened around the steering wheel. The security guard barely looked up as he waved me through. To the outside world, I was still Madison Carter, still one of them. But this time, I wasn't returning as a daughter. I was returning as a witness. Inside, the house was chilled and spotless, like it had been preserved more for legacy than for life. Judith was waiting in the sitting room, wearing a cashmere shawl and her usual diamond-studded armor, her lips curled into that performative smile she wore for journalists and investment partners, not family. "You look rested," she said, a note of surprise under the falseness. "I'm here because you said it was urgent," I replied, not moving to sit. Judith gestured toward the antique armchair across from her. "Don't be so cold, darling. This is still your home." I sat, but only because I wanted her to believe, for now, that I still played by her rules. She leaned forward, her tone softening. "Scott's worried about you. You left after the will reading, then disappeared." I needed space. To what? Dig through ghosts? Her voice sharpened. "You're not going to find anything, Madison. That part of your life is over. You're a Carter. It's time to act like one." "I am acting like one," I said, smiling thinly. "I'm preserving the truth. Isn't that what we pride ourselves on, legacy?" Her mask slipped, just for a second, before she reached for the envelope on the table. "I called you here because Gregory Phillips' death changes things. His files, his estate will be audited, and if anything unseemly emerges, it could harm all of us." She slid the envelope toward me. Inside was a list of names, transactions, legal documents, bribes, transfers, non-disclosure agreements. One name stood out, Vivian Carter, a trust account, closed days after my birth. "You knew," I said, staring at her, "all this time." Judith folded her hands neatly. "We did what was necessary to protect the family. By erasing a woman, a mother? She wasn't fit to raise you. We gave you a better life. You should be grateful." A bitter laugh escaped me before I could stop it. Grateful? For growing up feeling like a charity case in my own home? For never knowing who I truly was? Judith's eyes narrowed. "Careful, Madison. If you continue down this path, you'll find it hard to return." "I have no intention of returning," I said calmly. "This isn't a visit. It's a reckoning." Her knuckles whitened against the armrest. "And what exactly do you think you'll accomplish?" "Truth," I said simply. "Truth has a way of outlasting every illusion, even yours." As I left the sitting room, the envelope tucked tightly into my coat, I passed Scott on the stairs. He paused, eyes searching mine, guilt flickering behind the practiced charm he wore like cologne. "You shouldn't have come back," he murmured. "Then maybe you shouldn't have built this house out of lies." I didn't stop to see his reaction. That night, I returned to the hotel and laid everything out on the bed. Birth records, trust documents, Eleanor's testimony, and now, Judith's own trail of manipulation. Piece by piece, the puzzle was taking shape. They'd taken my name, my mother, my childhood, but I was taking back the story, and I was only getting started. The rain began just as I stepped out of the hotel lobby, the kind of slow, persistent drizzle that soaked you before you realized it. I walked without an umbrella, letting the cold water ground me in the present, remind me I was alive, angry, alert, and no longer afraid. My next stop wasn't on any official itinerary. It was a nursing home tucked behind a Lutheran church in southern Pittsfield. Most people didn't even know it existed, but I had the address, scribbled on the corner of Eleanor's final letter, almost an afterthought. If anything happens to me, ask for Thomas Harrington. Thomas had once been a groundskeeper at the estate, someone I barely noticed as a child, but now he might be the only person alive who knew what happened the night my mother was sent away. He met me in a small, sun-faded common room, his once sturdy frame now hunched and his hands trembling from age. But his eyes were still sharp, scanning me with the precision of someone who had spent a lifetime quietly observing power and surviving under its thumb. "I was wondering how long it'd take," he muttered as I sat. "You've got her eyes, you know. Vivian." "I didn't know her at all," I admitted. "Not really." Thomas nodded slowly. "They made sure of that." I slid a photo across the table, one I'd found buried in a drawer at the Carter house. Vivian, standing outside the estate gates, holding a baby with a look that was somewhere between defiance and grief. I didn't recognize the man beside her, but Thomas did. "That was Raymond Carter," he said quietly. "Your grandfather." The name hit like a fist to the chest. He was the one who convinced Gregory to take you from her, said she was unstable, said she'd ruin the family name. "Was it true?" I asked, even though I already knew the answer. "No," he said firmly. "Vivian had problems, sure, but nothing that called for erasing her from your life. She fought for you, Madison, harder than anyone. But Gregory and Judith, they had plans. They needed to clean up the past to build their empire, and no one stopped them." He looked away. "Some tried. Your grandfather's lawyer, Philip Anderson, quit over it. But no one listened, and by the time your mother ended up institutionalized, her story was already buried." I sat back, heart thudding. "Do you have proof?" He reached into a faded folder resting on his lap. Out came a photocopy of a letter, Gregory's own handwriting, dated 3 weeks after my birth, addressed to a Dr. Langston at a private facility in Maine. "Ensure she is kept indefinitely. No visitors unless pre-approved. Payment will be made through the Carter Trust." My throat tightened. There it was, the smoking gun. Thomas folded the letter and pushed it toward me. "You didn't deserve what they did to you, and neither did she." I left the nursing home clutching that letter like a lifeline. The rain had turned heavier, now hammering against my coat, but I didn't care. I wasn't that lost girl anymore, the one who once begged for scraps of love from people who saw her as a liability. Back at the hotel, I scanned the document into my encrypted drive. Then, after a long pause, I clicked open the secure audio folder Zoe had helped me build. The voice recording I'd made of Judith that morning, the one where she admitted, on tape, that Vivian had been unfit, now had context, a pattern, a plan. The walls of their empire were beginning to crack. And I wasn't done. I picked up the phone and dialed Philip Anderson. I hadn't spoken to him since I was 14, when he left the firm with barely a goodbye. When he answered, I said just one thing: "I have your old client's letter. We need to talk." There was a long pause on the other end. Then, finally, "I'll meet you tomorrow. And Madison, be careful. The Carters don't go down quietly." The line went dead, but inside me something long buried sparked to life. It wasn't rage, it was resolve. The Carter estate looked deceptively tranquil at dusk, bathed in the soft lavender light of a Massachusetts evening. The front garden had been freshly trimmed, the flagstone pathway lined with flickering lanterns, as if the family were trying to stage a picture-perfect welcome. But every step I took up that drive reminded me I was entering a lion's den, dressed as a guest. Tonight's dinner wasn't just a family gathering. It was an orchestrated display, Judith's attempt to maintain control over the narrative, to present a united Carter front in front of the distant cousins, the shareholders, and the family attorney. I knew she wasn't expecting me. I didn't ring the bell. I walked in through the side entrance, the same way I used to sneak into the pantry for midnight snacks as a child. The marble floors echoed under my heels, and for a brief moment I paused to listen. Laughter from the dining room, clinking silverware, someone offering a toast. I took a breath and stepped into the light. Silence snapped through the room like a string pulled tight. At the head of the table sat Judith, mid-toast, champagne flute frozen in the air. Beside her, Tiffany's eyes went wide, the glass of white wine in her hand visibly trembling. Marcus Chin, the family's longtime financial advisor, adjusted his glasses but said nothing. And Scott looked as though he'd seen a ghost, his fork still halfway to his mouth. "Don't stop on my account," I said coolly, setting my coat on the nearest chair. "After all, it's still my name on the deed." Judith recovered first. "Madison? What a surprise." "Not really," I replied. "After all, it's tradition to toast the family matriarch, isn't it?" I took a seat, ignoring the tension rippling down the table like a tidal wave. Every polite smile now looked like a grimace. Tiffany glanced at Judith, unsure whether to keep eating. Marcus cleared his throat, but no one followed. It wasn't just my presence that unsettled them. It was the unspoken question of what I knew, what I'd come to say, or worse, what I'd come to reveal. Scott leaned forward. "If this is about the will—" "This isn't about the will," I cut in. "Not entirely." Judith gave a tight smile. "Then why don't we let Madison speak her piece and get back to our dinner?" I pulled a small black recorder from my purse and placed it beside my plate. "Great, let's start with this." The light blinked red. Everyone stared. Judith's voice came through the speaker, sharp and unmistakable. "Vivian was unfit. She was never meant to raise a child, let alone one with Carter blood. Gregory did what had to be done. We all did." The room froze. Tiffany's wine glass cracked against the stem as her grip slipped. Marcus stiffened. Scott looked between them all like a man slowly realizing the water he was swimming in had always been poisoned. I shut off the recorder. "I'm done pretending," I said, my voice calm but firm. "I've spent years trying to bury the past, but it turns out you buried something else instead. My mother." Judith stood, face pale. "You don't understand." "No," I snapped. "You don't get to explain. Not anymore." I reached into my coat pocket and laid down a sealed envelope addressed to Marcus. Inside is a certified letter from Thomas Harrington. He was there. He saw everything. He kept receipts, and a copy of the letter Gregory sent to the psychiatric facility. Judith's hand twitched. "You don't know what you're doing." I stared at her, unblinking. "On the contrary, for the first time I know exactly what I'm doing." The table remained silent. The silverware stopped clinking. The performance was over. The illusion had shattered, and there was no cleaning up broken glass without getting cut. I stood, letting the silence linger, then said with chilling clarity, "Enjoy your dinner. It may be the last time you all sit at this table as a family." Then I turned and walked out, leaving behind a room full of ghosts, still dressed in flesh and silk. I didn't look back as I exited the dining room, but I could feel their stares clinging to my back like cold wind through an open grave. The weight of what I'd just done didn't settle on me until I reached the quiet hallway outside. The ornate mirrors reflected not just my image, but the person I had become. A woman sharpened by silence, steady enough to face down a room full of people who had once controlled every thread of her life. In the sitting room I paused, pulled out my phone, and texted just one word to Deanna. Delivered. Seconds later, the reply came. Good. The leak goes live at midnight. It was more than theatrics tonight. The recording, the letter, my return. It was all groundwork. For weeks, Diana, my mother's former confidant turned investigative journalist, had been combing through old hospital records, donation ledgers, and Gregory's archived correspondence. The real story wasn't just betrayal, it was conspiracy, and now the world would begin to see it. As I moved toward the front door, a soft voice called behind me. Madison? I turned. Marcus stood near the hallway arch, holding the envelope I had handed him. His tie was loosened, and for the first time in years, he didn't look like a man in control of outcomes. I didn't know the full extent, he said carefully. Judith and Gregory kept the real files locked away. What I had was curated, sanitized. That doesn't make you innocent, I said, eyes narrowing. No, he admitted, but maybe it makes me useful now. I eyed him, cautious. Why the sudden conscience? Marcus sighed, then opened the envelope and pulled out the first page. His brows furrowed as he read the letterhead. This hospital, I remember Vivian being listed as a donor. Gregory said it was posthumous. It wasn't, I said. She was alive when she signed those forms. She was committed, not killed, and she didn't die until years later. While I was in high school, Marcus's face drained of color. They said she died when you were 7. They lied. He looked at me for a long time. Then softly he asked, "What are you going to do?" I didn't hesitate. I'm going to bring every single piece of this into the light, and if you're smart, you'll decide which side of the truth you want to stand on, before it burns the whole Carter legacy to ash. He nodded once, slowly. I'll call you tomorrow. There's something else you need to see. It's not in your files. Then bring it, I said. We're running out of time. Outside, the air had cooled, thick with the scent of gardenias and secrets. I walked down the drive to my car, each step carrying the echo of the confrontation behind me. The Carter estate stood like a mausoleum, beautiful and hollow, built on the bones of women like my mother, discarded and silenced. As I slid into the driver's seat, I looked at the dashboard clock. 11:42 p.m. 18 minutes until Deanna's story went live. 18 minutes until the press would receive everything. Vivian's admission records, photos of her bruised face at the clinic, her handwritten plea for help. And at the center of it all, the Carter name. My phone vibrated again, this time a blocked number. I hesitated, then answered. A distorted voice came through, calm but unfamiliar. You think you've found everything, but you've only opened the first door. A click. The line went dead. I stared at the screen, heart thudding. For the first time since returning, a ripple of something colder than anger spread through me. Unease. I wasn't the only one unearthing truths. And someone out there wasn't ready for me to finish the story. The front page of the New Haven Chronicle carried a headline so large it nearly bled off the edges. Prominent Carter family implicated in long-buried psychiatric scandal. There it was, Vivian's name, my mother's name, no longer a whispered shame behind velvet curtains. Beneath it, a grainy photo of her in a hospital gown, her eyes, swollen but resolute, stared back at me like a ghost clawing through time to finally be seen. I stood in Deanna's modest office above a worn coffee shop in downtown New Haven, where she had printed out the first edition before the public release. She tapped the page, her tone steady but low. It's out there now. The media are going to eat it up. But you need to prepare for I was raised in their shadows, Diana, I replied, still gripping the paper. Let them try. A knock sounded on the office door, then Marcus slipped inside. He looked worn, his usual sleek demeanor dulled by what had clearly been a long night. I brought it, he said simply, lifting a leather folder with the Carter family crest embossed in gold. Diana arched a brow. This what you teased last night? He opened the folder and removed a document. A court-sealed copy of a guardianship transfer, signed and notarized 24 years ago. Gregory wasn't just Vivian's husband, Marcus said. He was granted full legal control over her medical decisions a week after she was committed. Wait, I said slowly, reading the dates. That's when I was 3. And Vivian was declared mentally unfit just days later, Marcus continued, which meant Gregory had legal authority to dictate not just her treatment, but your custody arrangements. I looked up, the air suddenly tight in my lungs. Are you telling me he had me removed from her life? On paper, he made her disappear, Diana said grimly, and then he erased her. Legally, financially, personally. That's why you never got birthday cards, why her name vanished from records. You were written out, on purpose. I sat down, dizzy from the rush of clarity. For years I thought my mother had given up. Let them take me, let me grow up under Judith's manicured tyranny without so much as a whisper. But she hadn't abandoned me. She'd been silenced. There's something else, Marcus said, sliding out one more page. This came from a nurse who worked the night shift at St. Francis Mental Health Center. She recognized Vivian's photo. Said Vivian used to speak into a recorder every evening, left behind tapes. Tapes? Diana leaned forward. Do they still exist? No one knows, but this nurse, she kept a log. She said one night, Vivian handed her a slip of paper. On it, she wrote one sentence. If they find this, tell my daughter I never forgot her. I felt something fracture inside me, something too old to name, but deep enough to ache. We were silent for a long moment, the kind of silence that feels like both mourning and ignition. Then Diana stood. This is enough for a second wave, but you'll need more to force Gregory into public defense. He won't break unless cornered. I folded the paper slowly, then it's time to corner him. Marcus handed me a key. Judith's old summer home, Rhode Island coast. They used to hide personal files there, including off-record financials and recordings. When was the last time anyone went? Not since Judith's stroke, he said. That house has been gathering dust and secrets ever since. I turned to Diana. You still want a front row seat? She grinned. I want the whole damn theater. I smiled tightly. Then pack a bag. We're going to the place where they buried my mother's voice. And this time, I would be the one digging it back up. The road to the Rhode Island coast curved like a memory, winding, uneven, bordered by woods that whispered things I wasn't ready to hear. Marcus drove in silence, his eyes fixed ahead, hands steady on the wheel. Diana sat beside me in the backseat, reviewing legal pads of notes and copies of the guardianship documents, her highlighters squeaking against the paper every few seconds. The house came into view just past the old iron gate. Peeling white shutters, overgrown ivy climbing the porch pillars, the Carter family crest still nailed crookedly to the arched wooden door. It looked less like a summer retreat and more like a mausoleum someone forgot to lock. This was Judith's idea of solitude, Diana muttered as we stepped out. It was where they stored what they didn't want anyone else to see, Marcus said, unlocking the front door with the old key. The hinges groaned and the smell hit us all at once. Mildew, cedar, old paper, and something fainter, like lavender, long faded. I stepped inside and felt the air shift, not just from dust or time, but something colder, heavier. The hallway stretched ahead, lined with portraits of men in gray suits and women with careful eyes. I paused at the one of Gregory and Judith, their expressions caught mid-fake smile, their hands barely touching. The study was just as Marcus had described it. Oak-paneled walls, a grand fireplace, a mahogany desk with drawers that hadn't been touched in years. Diana took out gloves and began carefully opening file cabinets while I moved to the bookshelf behind the desk. Third row, left corner. Books misaligned. I tugged at one, and the shelf clicked forward slightly. Hidden hinge. I gave it a push. The panel creaked open. Behind it, a small locked cabinet with a numeric dial. Marcus stepped beside me. Judith always used Amelia's birth date. Try it. I hesitated, then turned the dials. 0716. A small click. Inside were a dozen cassette tapes, stacked in brittle plastic cases, each labeled in my mother's handwriting. August 1999, November 2001, Madison, her voice. They know I know. I stared, my hands shook. Diana, I whispered. She rushed over, her eyes widening. Is that her voice? I nodded, grabbing the oldest tape. Do we have a player? Marcus gestured to the far corner. Try that shelf unit. Judith used to listen to classical music here. I popped in the tape. Static. Then a click. And then? If you're hearing this, I'm probably gone. I don't know who will find it, but my name is Vivian Carter, and they locked me away because I refused to give up my daughter. Her voice, cracked but unwavering, like gravel over silk. I sat down slowly as the tape continued. Gregory forged the papers. Judith backed him. They needed me silent to rewrite the legacy, to give their own child the Carter name. I kept writing letters to Madison, but they never got through. They changed her address, told me she'd moved, but I kept the recordings, because if one day she finds me, she'll know I never stopped trying. Tears stung my eyes, but I didn't blink. I couldn't afford to miss a single word. Diana was already dialing a contact. This is gold. If we authenticate these tapes, it's not just public sympathy. It's evidence of conspiracy and abuse. We'll release it when the timing's right, I said hoarsely, not before. I looked around the study, now transformed in my mind from dusty relic to crime scene. They buried my mother's voice here, I whispered, but I'll make sure the world hears it. And just as I reached to stop the tape, a sudden click echoed from upstairs. We froze. Did you lock the front door? Diana asked sharply. Marcus nodded, hand going to his waistband instinctively. Another creak. Footsteps. Not ours. Whoever was hiding skeletons in this house just realized they weren't the only one digging, and I had no intention of leaving quietly. The courtroom buzzed with the low hum of whispered speculation, reporters adjusting cameras, family acquaintances craning for a better look, and attorneys on both sides murmuring legal strategy beneath their breath. The state seal of Connecticut loomed above the judge's bench, its presence solemn and cold. I sat behind the plaintiff's table, palms flat on the cool wood, my breath steady despite the storm I'd unleashed. Gregory Carter entered flanked by his attorney, his posture stiff, his jaw clenched like stone. He wore his finest navy suit and the same smug air he always wore to funerals and boardroom eulogies. But today, the coffin wasn't metaphorical. It was his reputation, his legacy, and the truth he buried for decades. To his left, Judith sat in a wheelchair, lips pursed, face hollowed by age and consequence. Her stroke had silenced one half of her body, but not the venom in her eyes. She refused to look at me even now. Diana leaned over, whispering, "They're betting you'll break. Stay composed." I gave a faint nod. The judge cleared her throat. We're here today to review the emergency petition for public release and legal authentication of the materials uncovered at the Carter's summer residence, as well as the motion to unseal prior guardianship records involving the late Vivian Carter. A ripple moved through the courtroom at my mother's name. For so long she had been a footnote. Now she was the centerpiece. The prosecution began with Diana's opening statement. Her voice was firm, the cadence sharpened by months of buried fury. "Your Honor, what we are presenting today is not just a challenge to a guardianship order. It is a plea for justice on behalf of a woman institutionalized without due process, whose daughter was stripped from her, whose voice was intentionally buried under layers of manipulation and legal deceit. We have evidence, testimony, and recordings that paint a damning portrait of abuse masked as inheritance preservation." She gestured to the table where the cassette tapes were displayed under clear casing, the labels visible. Madison, her voice, and they know, I watched. As the judge reviewed the materials, her brows pinched, her fingers steepled. Then, the first recording was played. "This is Vivian Carter. They're coming again tonight with more pills. I pretend to take them, but they make me forget. I'm scared they'll erase me from her memory too. But I keep this recorder so that one day, Madison will know I loved her every day, even when they told me not to." The room went silent. I could feel breath hitching across the gallery, reporters scribbling furiously, but I only heard her voice. Gregory shifted in his chair. Diana approached the witness stand and called Marcus. He took the oath and testified with precision, laying out how the tapes were recovered, how the guardianship records had been sealed by a family lawyer now deceased, and how the nurse's affidavit matched dates in Vivian's hospital logs. Under cross-examination, Gregory's attorney tried to diminish the relevance. "These tapes, Your Honor, are emotionally charged but unverifiable in origin. They're labeled in Vivian's handwriting, stored in her voice recorder, in a hidden cabinet behind a bookshelf in a private estate," Diana shot back. "If that's not intent, what is?" The judge called for a recess. I stepped out into the corridor, heart pounding. Outside, rain had begun to fall. Slow, deliberate, the kind that made people think twice before speaking. I leaned against the cool marble wall. This wasn't just about revenge anymore. It was about resurrection. For my mother. For me. And I wasn't done yet. The courtroom reconvened just past 3 o'clock. The rain outside had quickened, its steady beat against the tall windows now like a drum roll, an ominous prelude to whatever came next. I returned to my seat, this time no longer a mere petitioner, but the living testament to every injustice committed behind closed doors under the guise of protection and family legacy. The judge took her seat. "Before we proceed, the court acknowledges the weight of the materials presented. We will now hear from the final witness requested by the plaintiff." Diana stood. "We call Eleanor Wright." A hush fell. For years, Eleanor had disappeared after leaving her position as the Carter family housekeeper, one of the few who had known Vivian intimately. I had tracked her through a sequence of handwritten recipes my mother kept, each marked with initials and dates, like breadcrumb trails. Eleanor entered, frail but proud. Her silver hair was pulled into a tight bun. Her cardigan clung to her shoulders, yet her voice, when she raised her hand and swore to tell the truth, was as strong as the memory she carried. "I was there the night they took Vivian from the house," she said quietly. "I wasn't supposed to be. Gregory had given the staff early dismissal, but I stayed to clean the nursery. That's when I saw the nurse sedate her. Vivian was screaming Madison's name." The gallery rippled with discomfort. Oh, I wanted to stop them. But Gregory said if I spoke out, he'd say I stole from the family. I was a single black woman with no money and no record of employment outside the Carters. I was scared, and I've regretted it every day since. Eleanor reached into her handbag and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a photograph, Vivian holding an infant me, taken in the backyard of our old house. Her face glowed, her arms strong, protective. She gave this to me the night before, said, "If I disappear, one day give this to Madison. She'll know I never gave her away willingly." I bit down on my lip to keep the emotion from spilling out. This wasn't just evidence. It was the proof my heart had been aching for all these years. Gregory's face was flushed now. His attorney tried to object, but the judge waved him off. The courtroom had already judged. After closing statements, the judge requested a recess before her ruling. Outside, as we stepped onto the courthouse steps, reporters swarmed. Flashbulbs, microphones. I said nothing. I didn't need to. The truth was already out, and the weight of it hung in the air like a sword freshly drawn from its sheath. Hours later, we returned for the verdict. In light of the evidence, sworn testimonies, and newly recovered materials, the judge announced, "This court finds substantial and credible proof that the guardianship and institutionalization of Vivian Carter were conducted under fraudulent pretense and without medical justification. The records shall be unsealed. Furthermore, Madison Carter's legal name is to be restored in full as Vivian Carter's sole rightful heir." I closed my eyes, exhaling for what felt like the first time in decades. I had not only survived their rewriting of my life, I had undone it. Outside, the rain had cleared. As Diana, Marcus, and I walked away from the courthouse, I glanced back once, not at the people, but at the building itself. A monument to truth when someone dares to fight hard enough for it. I didn't go back to the family estate. Instead, I used my inheritance to establish a foundation in my mother's name, dedicated to women erased by systems designed to silence them. The past was no longer a wound. It was a weapon I'd forged into something healing, and though ghosts still walked beside me, I no longer ran from them. I walked forward, with purpose and finally, peace. Thank you for watching this story to the very end. The final reckoning wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming truth, identity, and the voice of a daughter long silenced. Madison's journey reminds us that sometimes the deepest betrayals come from those who share our blood. But so does the greatest strength to rise again. If this story moved you, share it with someone who's still fighting to be heard. And remember, justice doesn't always come quickly, but it always begins with courage. Until next time, stay strong, stay brave, and never let them write your ending.